Bernie Sanders didn't come. I'm quite sure that Bernie Sanders understood this dynamic before then. And so
I saw Bernie Sanders speak in college. He made precisely the same
Right.
critique. He spent most of his speech talking about media monopolies.
Here's the other part of why what we talked about earlier is BS. Because all of those journalists, right, they're making it like he's being conspiratorial and he's being Trump-like. What Bernie Sanders is doing is he's not discovering the truth of what is problematic with the media. This is political campaigning. And the other conversation that Brian Williams could have had, and we played that stuff earlier, but the other conversation that Brian Williams had, if he didn't choose Bob Costa from the Washington Post or the other reporter from the Wall Street Journal, Costas, I mean, he's a good reporter. Started out covering right-wing stuff. Let's say Brian Williams had a different MSNBC contributor on to talk about this. Let's say he had me on. My perspective wouldn't be, he's frustrated about the campaign. This is coming out of frustration in the way that, like, a child, when you get frustrated because you won't give them they can't watch a second episode of television or something like this. They're complaining. He's complaining. No, what I would say, like, look, this is a reality that Bernie Sanders knows to be the case. We used to talk about media concentration in this country and the power of wealthy people owning the press as being problematic. It still is, even in the era of Donald Trump, when we have more reliance on the press than we may have wanted to, admit in the past. And Bernie Sanders is using this as an example of how corporate interests are aligned and how they own this network that we're talking on, the other networks that we could be talking on, and all the papers. And that we need to rebalance stuff. And from a political perspective, this is a very smart move. This is a very smart move. Like, Brian Williams and his guests are not above taking a cynical look and looking at the political value of these machinations. And that's what they do for virtually every other single candidate. But they don't do that for Bernie Sanders. They don't say, with his brand of politics, this actually makes a lot of sense. Right. Because it's perfectly consistent with everything he's saying. And he's saying that there is people at the 1%, let's call it, have aligned interests. They don't necessarily have to meet at Davos to plan out their year's agenda. They have aligned interests, and they work in those interests, and they have outsized power, and that's what you get. But even the way that they framed that segment was indicative of the problems. And even though Jeff Bezos doesn't work at, doesn't own MSNBC, Comcast does, GE does, and they're more comfortable, and Brian Williams certainly understands this, with stuff that is a little bit more to the right than where they've been in the past.
You don't need to give Jake Tapper questions or talking points. But if we did a really easy thought experiment, if the CNN ad lineup was filled primarily with Teamsters unions and UAW ads, it's very unlikely that he would say, John Delaney, you say that Bernie's healthcare plan is going to ruin American society. Would you like to elaborate that?
I disagree with that.
Maybe the question to Delaney, but the entire frame of the question would be massaged and influenced by the context.
Jake Tapper is not sensitive to what ads are on there. No. Jake Tapper wouldn't be hired if this was...
I'm not giving you I'm not saying linearly he watches it.
Yeah,
I'm
in the
saying
same way that it is arranged now.
Broader atmosphere, the filtering that Chomsky talked about.
I don't even think it's that sensitive, because certainly I know that unions used to advertise on MSNBC. I don't know if they still do, but unions used to advertise on MSNBC because they thought they could aggregate the biggest audience of the left there. BP used to advertise on MSNBC because they thought they could
branding
aggregate
themselves as green.
They could aggregate the biggest group of most outspoken critics of them there. The advertising thing is ebbs and flows. The bottom line is these are owned by major corporations. They will hire people who are corporate friendly. Period. End of story. There is no specific pressure that comes in these news organizations, but the general flow of things is what leads you down these certain paths. What you get rewarded with leads you down these paths, and they're not even specific. It's not if you do this, you'll get that. It's just broad principles that you see, and you see them more, and that's how you got through the door in the first place.
Yep. I co-sign everything that you said. Can I just add 2 things real quick?
Please.
I agree with Chad Vigorous or Pretty Bad Lefty's take on Twitter, which is that Bernie stands to pick up more votes from Joe Rogan fans and Cardi B fans than he does from people who stan MSNBC. So maybe this won't be so bad for him. And 2, can we just appreciate the terminally basic mean girl shade on display in that first clip? Like, you are only talking about me for attention because your campaign is crashing and burning. Sad. Like, if anyone is using a Trumpian line, I think it's that.
Right. I think that's true. And frankly, I think that on balance, I'm not quite sure that even the MSNBC discussion doesn't help Bernie. I mean,
Definitely helps
to the
Bernie.
extent that there were people out there who do have issues with corporate control who watch MSNBC, there's some. I think it also raises him out there. I don't think this in its totality actually hurts Bernie at all. I think Bernie wants to be in the news, and I don't think it necessarily hurts Bernie to be criticized by Brian Williams or by someone from the Wall Street Journal. In fact, let's recall what the sort of one of the biggest, piercing things that pierced through the noise in terms of Bernie's ad campaigns was, here are the people who don't endorse me. And having them all line up to not endorse him and to criticize him, I think is probably not a bad thing. It's just people should be aware of what the dynamics are and how this works, because there's more to be gleaned from this than just how it impacts Bernie Sanders. I mean, we should be watching the news always with this perspective and this understanding. These are broad, they're very sort of like long, broad strokes in terms of what impacts the media in this way. And so